one of the interesting things about this current kind of new Trump war on drugs is it's gone to a new extreme and a pretty out there extreme in terms of you can just blow up. You can blow up boats. It's pretty hardcore doctrine. You just blow up alleged drug traffickers, and I don't know how much can be sustained, and what that does for kind of U.S. rule of law as well. Having that kind of issue. Also, if you say, okay, cartels are foreign terrorist organizations, and there's more than 200,000 firearms trafficked a year from the United States to cartels in Mexico, then why not hit those people trafficking the guns to the cartels with terrorist charges? That would stop. Stop them.
You're listening to Narcotica, a podcast giving you the straight dope about drugs and the people who use them.
The war on drugs has been used as cover for countless atrocities, and that word atrocities is not being used lightly. From CIA planes that deliver ecocide to rainforests in Colombia, to the millions of incarcerated people caged in the United States, to empowering violent gang wars, to the systems that have led to 1 million preventable deaths and counting from drug overdoses over the last 2 decades, it's not a war because wars have relatively equal sides. This is a genocide against people who use drugs. And of course, it's not really about the drugs at all. Drugs are pretext. Drugs are perfectly legible boogeyman to the public, used as a justification to advance racist draconian policy. But something new is happening. The drug war is intensifying in unprecedented fashion in a manner that makes the DEA kicking down doors and doing no-knock raids sound quaint. The United States military is currently on a spree of blowing up suspected, quote, narcoterrorists and their vessels in the Caribbean and Pacific near Venezuela and Colombia. These boats are allegedly filled with drugs, headed to the shores of North America, despite zero evidence being provided that suggests that these are actually drug operations. And if that's not enough, grainy footage of boats being shredded is being posted online by the Pentagon, brazenly bragging about war crimes and extrajudicial killings. Today, we're going to dive into what the heck is actually going on. I'm Troy Farah, and you're listening to Narcotica. Today's guest is Ioan Grillo, a journalist from the UK who has been living in Mexico since 2000. He is author of 3 books, most recently Blood, Gun, Money, How America Arms Gangs and Cartels. Ioan, welcome to the show.
Hey, great to be here. How are you all doing?
Great, yeah. And also with us today are Narcotica co-hosts Zachary Siegel and Aaron Ferguson. Say hi, guys.
Hi, guys. Happy to be here.
Hey,
Yeah.
how's it going?
Yeah, it's been a while since Zach's been on the show, but it's great to have you back. This situation is developing fast, and some of our stats may be out of date by the time listeners hear this. So, we encourage you to check the Wikipedia page, 2025 United States military strikes on alleged drug traffickers. I think it's a fairly unbiased resource. But Zach, why don't you give us the current rundown of the situation?
Yeah, it felt like kind of an emergency podcast moment where the long drug war has seemingly edged into full-on military war. So based on what we know right now, here's a current rundown. Starting around September 1st of 2025, the U.S. has deployed warships, fighter jets, spy planes, thousands of sailors to the Caribbean Sea. Strikes have also hit South American waters and in the Pacific, but mostly the strikes are hitting small vessels in international waters, boats mostly coming out of Venezuela. The result of all these military assets convening on the international waters around America is 13 airstrikes and counting. A death toll from these strikes stands at least 57 people. That's according to the AP today on Tuesday, October 28th. And out of all these strikes, it appears there's been 3 survivors. And so just to give you a sense of how fluid all of this is, just this morning, there were 4 strikes that killed 14 people. And all of this is being done, kind of as Troy noted in the intro, quite brazenly. out in the open. We've got Pete Hegseth, three sheets to the wind, this SecDef, or the Secretary of War, as he calls himself. He is saying things like, quote, narco terrorists intending to bring poison to our shores will find no safe harbor anywhere in our hemisphere. So that's where things are. And we should probably bring in Ioan to get us situated here.
Thanks. Yeah. So I would say with this, this situation brings two things together which are connected but a bit different. On one side, you've got this hard line of the war on drugs, a new era of the war on drugs. I mean, this is an unprecedented new era of the war on drugs, which is this new doctrine that you can fire missiles at alleged drug traffickers and just blow them away, which is completely new. We had the war on drugs beginning or considered to begin in 1971 with Richard Nixon declaring drugs the public enemy number one of America. Then the phase of Ronald Reagan and so forth, and this is a whole new thing. Now, within that, I'm based in Mexico, and from the very beginning of the year when Trump took power, we've kind of been on red alert here about these strikes hitting Mexican soil, and what this would mean, what the reaction would be in Mexico. And President Claudia Sheinbaum of Mexico has been quite diplomatic and made a lot of effort to avoid the strikes in Mexico itself up until now. And she did this by things like clamping down on fentanyl trafficking. And there has been a huge amount of fentanyl coming through Mexico the last few years. They We've been quite effective on clamping down on fentanyl traffickers. Now, I believe that is because you have a system of corruption within Mexico where the government, the President Trump can pressure Mexican government can pressure the generals pressure the cartels pressure the smaller traffickers, and they actually reduce the flow of fentanyl that way to an extent. That's one of the things. Another thing they've done is these bigger expulsions, basically flying alleged drug cartel bosses into U.S. custody without, trampling on their extradition appeals. Another thing they've done, but various things they've done is helped steer away this American war machine, hungry American war machine right now from bombing Mexico. And I know for a fact I've been in touch with a lot of people, active in the US military, active agents, all kinds of people. I know there was a very real chance earlier in the year of just hitting targets in Mexico, and there still is a real chance. And they were hungry looking for targets. But they steered this away, and it's become more of a focus on Venezuela. Now it's getting expanding. In fact, Venezuela, Colombia, and this is expanding now. What this gets into is a couple of things with this. So one is this is really hitting boats taking cocaine. I mean, as Troy said in the introduction, we don't know. We don't have proof. We see these images of a boat that gets blown away, and then we've got interviews that have come out with some of the families of the people on the boats or some of the survivors, which include people from Ecuador, Venezuela, Colombia, and various countries. Possibly Mexico. The Mexican Navy just went out to asked by the Coast Guard to rescue one of the people killed in the attacked in these strikes, who survived and was like floating in the sea, and the Coast Guard called the Mexican Navy to go and bring him in. We haven't heard his nationality yet, but it could be Mexican as well. But this main focus has been on the Pacific, a bit further south of Mexico, around Colombia, and the Caribbean around Venezuela, Colombia. Now, a couple of big things. First, this is mainly cocaine. So it's obviously the big deal in the Mexican overdose, so in the US overdose crisis, the last few years has been about fentanyl and opioids, and this is hitting cocaine. Now, there still is a lot of cocaine in the United States, but it's down the list in terms of it being found in victims of drug overdoses. And often, if it is, it's because there's cocaine with fentanyl in it, which I know that Zach has written a lot about, and from what my research found, I looked deeply into this, it's more likely that's because the dealers who were cutting up fentanyl and cutting up cocaine ended up putting fentanyl in the cocaine, and that's kind of dropped off a bit now anyway. But it's kind of not really the crisis or kind of a big public outrage about cocaine like there was back in the 1980s with the crack epidemic. So they're hitting cocaine. I mean, I think this is going to be affecting drug traffickers. I mean, you'd be pretty nuts to get in a boat right now with cocaine over the Caribbean or Pacific. It is going to affect people and routes, but let's see how they adapt to that. But the other bigger thing here is this is a political operation for regime change in Venezuela. So now, the Venezuela situation, I've been to Venezuela 3 times. The last time I was there was 2016. I did a Time magazine front cover about Venezuela and about the situation. I read about this that initially, going back in the 2000s, I was sympathetic to Hugo Chavez and what he was doing. It seemed like this kind of interesting democratic socialism. But I admit, by the time my last 2 trips, 2015, 2016, it was a humanitarian crisis there. That's what I saw on the ground. I saw people malnourished. I saw people in a very horrific state, and I saw repression from the government there. I did a Time magazine cover was entitled "Venezuela is Dying," and I was quite heavily attacked by the Venezuelan government after that magazine story came out. And there is, the last year in the elections of 2024, there's a pretty credible case that there was widespread fraud. However, also we've got to look at the history of U.S. regime change in Latin America, going back to Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz in the 50s, Salvador Allende in the 70s, the 80s attempts at destabilizing the Sandinista regime, sponsoring the Contras, and all of these things, to more recent cases in the Middle East, of Iraq, of Afghanistan. US regime change has been pretty disastrous in most occasions. There is one thing that they're citing now, which is Panama, which we'll get into, that happened in 1809. But then, so what they're doing is they're pushing this idea of blowing up boats in the Caribbean as a form of threats and pressure on the Venezuelan government. However, I don't think it's actually working that well in that case. And I think they're hitting a bit of a speed bump there, in that the Maduro regime is tightening quite well. We're not seeing signs of a coup so far. I mean, maybe I'm wrong there, but they're trying to encourage a coup or an uprising. It's not happening right now. And so, are they going to? Is Trump going to go for a full invasion of Venezuela? That's a big risk, and that's some of the calculation there. So yeah, there's really these kind of two interlapping stories of the war on drugs and this idea of regime change against Venezuela. And just to add to that, they've indicted Nicolas Maduro for working with drug traffickers, put a $50 million reward for him. My research shows he probably did work with drug traffickers, but it still means they're using the drug thing as a reason for a political regime change for other reasons as well.
Wow, yeah, that's a lot, and to me it seems to be coming straight out of the type of playbook that an authoritarian regime goes based on when they're meddling with the elections of other countries and when they're taking military action without transparency. I've been involved quite a bit on the United States side with drug user activism and trying to push back against the narrative. I mean, we've talked a lot on this show about how the drug war has been turned on the American people. And, I'm sure we have the US military being turned on American cities now under the guise of, well, it's a drug-fueled haze and we're going to go in with the military and lock everything down. And there are all these legal battles going on around that. And then meanwhile, you have ICE agents that are disguising themselves and wearing masks and driving around in cars with the Mexican flag on their hood, and really kind of engaging in a lot of the same undercover operations that we see in drug related enforcement, right? It's like exporting the undercover officer to other avenues. And because we're used to dealing with undercover cops, as people who use drugs, you always have to wonder, hey, is this person a cop or not? That's not something that I think a lot of other folks have come to worry about until now. But it seems to me like you can throw this word drugs out and you can throw the word boogeyman out, which is essentially drug trafficking, and it's a conversation stopper, at least here in the United States, because we have this doctrinaire of drugs are bad, and drug traffickers have been depicted as the worst of the worst in this entire scenario. And that's been going on. We've been conditioned to think of drug trafficking that way. I've heard a lot of people that I would agree on a lot of other topics with blame drug trafficking for the fentanyl overdose crisis. Even though they understand like the drug war is just a big sham, they'll still blame drug traffickers and say that they're unscrupulous. So there's all of this sort of indoctrination on our end, and then the scope creep of the way that the government lacks transparency in its actions here in our rhetoric. But I'm wondering about over there, what is the popular rhetoric around what is going on here? Are people siding with this and saying, drugs are bad? The United States is helping us to root this out. Are they seeing it for what it is, which is as you've described it? And how is it being perceived in these places?
Yeah, sure thing. Yeah, look, I've been here 25 years and I covered the Mexican cartel wars right through. So it's a lot of crazy stuff that I've seen, a lot of stuff that I could never have imagined, when I first began. I've been to morgues where they had 49 bodies, all decapitated, all with their hands and feet cut off. I've seen, and mothers and mothers who've had their kids dragged away and they've been looking around and found them years afterwards in mass graves, and some pretty horrific stuff. At the same time, this has changed over the years. So, when we go back to say 2010, 2009, 2010, and then was when you got the record amount of marijuana actually going from Mexico to the United States. And, I was with the Mexican military going around in helicopters when they were burning marijuana fields. And back then I was like, this is absolutely crazy that marijuana, a fairly benevolent, drug. There are issues with mental illness and so forth, and I've got even some in my own family. But anyway, there are issues with that, but still a fairly benevolent drug. And how come they're allowing, which is already being kind of tolerated in certain amount in the United States, and it's funding full-on death squads in Mexico? This is completely out there. Now, I did, I wrote editorials back, in 2000, 10, 11, 12, but very much in favor of the marijuana legalization in the United States, partly as a way to reduce the resources of cartels. Now, the legalization happened, and I've more recent, you've seen a collapse of the marijuana of the coming from Mexico, but it hasn't stopped the violence. So I say, okay, I hoped it would. I hoped it would reduce the power of cartels, reduce the violence in Mexico. And it hasn't been the case. And there has been a shift over to the synthetic drugs, which is an interesting story about how, the whole issue getting synthetic drugs. But you'll be back to your question more about the perception. I would say that there's a range within Mexico. There's a big range of things here, of how people see this. There's a lot of people who blame their own government in Mexico, which has been involved with corruption and drug trafficking for decades and decades, and continues to be so. Even though I'm also sympathetic in some ways to the current president, and I think she's done, the current presidency has done some good things in terms of raising the minimum wage and uplifting poor people and so forth, but there still is this issue of corruption. But there's also is this look at the United States and like, okay, well, United States, it's Americans who buy all the drugs. They're the ones who buying the drugs and supplying all this. And America supplies the guns, which is the book, my last book I wrote about how this, and it's undeniable, this huge iron river of guns, and America's kind of hypocrites in this for that reason. I think what you said before about the issue of drugs and labeling drugs. One of the interesting things about this current kind of new Trump war on drugs is it's gone to a new extreme, and a pretty out there extreme in terms of you can just blow up, you can blow up boats. It's a pretty hardcore doctrine. You just blow up alleged drug traffickers, and I don't know how that much can be sustained. and what that does for kind of US rule of law as well, having that kind of issue. But it doesn't seem to be actually having much of a war on drugs at home in the United States. I don't really get any sign there's this sort of like when you had the Reagan war on drugs, there was a big just say no campaign, it might not have worked, but it was happening. There's a big just say no campaign. There's all of these things, Nancy Reagan, and there's none of that right now in the US. There's just we're going to blow up, we're going to like missile, and you've still got people selling, selling drugs in the corners, the open air drug markets in the US while you're blowing up drug boats. So that's
I
one
mean,
thing.
how much cocaine can be on one of these boats in the first place? Like that's like to me, it just seems like so disproportionate. You have how many bricks of cocaine blowing up an entire boat? The evidence is at the bottom of the ocean. The cocaine is
Yeah.
totally gone. Who knows? Let's say like just benefit of the doubt, these boats are full of cocaine. Like last I checked, there's no drought on the streets. Like what are these all going to Miami? Like I'm just so confused about like there's a fentanyl crisis in the US, so we're gonna blow up these boats full of cocaine. And then as you were saying, there's this like whole other parallel military posture toward Venezuela. Just like it just does not add up narratively, and they're just blowing up boats. Like it just seems
Yeah,
utterly insane.
I don't think they've thought it through. I don't think it's
No.
been. I think it's kind of being made up as going along. So like you had the designation of cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, which happened on when Trump came in his first day of office, January 20th. He gave the executive order. It took about a month to select the cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. Now, again, this is a difficult, confusing situation, and there's like a lot of different things that can be true at the same time. The fact that cartels in Mexico are super violent is totally true. The fact that some of the activities they've done in Mexico, is terroristic in terms of spreading terror. I mean, there's generally horrific things happening by these are real vicious networks here. However, also if you say, okay, cartels are foreign terrorist organizations and there's more than 200,000 firearms trafficked a year from the United States to cartels in Mexico, then why not hit those people trafficking the guns to the cartels with terrorist charges? That would stop that.
It's material support or
Yeah, but
whatever, you
exactly.
know?
There's a specific clause inside the terrorist legislation of providing material order, because a lot of the people who traffic guns to cartels did no prison time at all, even when it was proven those guns they sold were used to kill, even an American agent in one case. The guy did like no prison time. But yeah, but on the other thing we are talking about a second before about the idea of labeling narco terrorists. There's been, I'd say, like this history that now they're going against the Venezuelan government and also saying, well, these are involved in drug trafficking, which I believe they have been at least. But at the same time, the history of the United States will say, okay, we'll use sometimes we'll ally with people who are involved in drug trafficking if they're convenient for us. So, in Latin America, the Contras was a classic case. The Contras were being funded by the CIA against the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, and some of them were involved in cocaine trafficking. I recently did an interview with Carlos Leda, who was one of the founders of the Medellin cartel, and he was talking about confirming some of that as well. Although there was many people, he was also a witness against Noriega of Panama. Noriega of Panama, they worked with and was on the CIA payroll for some time until he became too unwieldy, kind of, and started siding with Cuba and started going, against the United States. Then they took him out on the drug charges. And so they'll kind of use this on both sides. Sometimes it can be convenient if there's a government or a guerrilla group or something. Afghanistan, the Northern Alliance, again involved in heroin. In the Vietnam Wars or Vietnam Laos War, a big guerrilla group there. The Hmong, the secret army, were involved in heroin and opium. So sometimes the US will ally with people if the drugs will, help them to support their cause, and then they'll use the drugs against them, like in the case of Venezuela right now.
Right. Yeah. And it seems like a great way to sidestep the rules of engagement because there's this general agreement that the United States has been convincing everyone that drugs are bad and going around the world decrying drugs. So it's an excellent tool if you want to get away with doing things with low transparency because it's like, oh, we're just blowing up drug traffickers. We don't need to be accountable to the international rules of engagement, Geneva Convention, throw all that out. These are just drug traffickers. Whereas if you have a country that starts a war of aggression against a neighboring country, everyone wants to know what's happening. Everyone wants to know, hey, why did you have a right to do this? What do the international rules of engagement say about this? Should we question whether or not this is permissible? So it seems to me like this is just a great way to get something done. I mean, and drugs always have been a great way to get something done with very little transparency. We are so used to, our idea of due process. I've heard a lot about due process with all of the talk about immigration. I mean, for drug users, our idea of due process is a broken system whereby if you have enough money, you're fine. You can have drugs, you can basically get away with impunity with whatever you do. If you're an American citizen and you have enough money, you don't really have to worry about it. And I know that exists to a certain extent in a lot of other countries. It's a little bit more overt. It's like you don't go to court, you just hand you hand the federale a lot of money, or they take your passport and you give them a lot of money and they take it back. But it just seems really convenient for someone who wants to run an authoritarian regime with very little transparency. And there's been a lot of talk around checks and balances on the presidency. And what constitutional bulwarks are there against the president exercising the level of authority that he is right now and that their administration is right now. So to me, it seems like, things like this, and I don't know what the trajectory will be. Is this going to just be swept under the dustbin of the next cascade of bullshit that happens next week? I mean, I remember the quaint days when Obama wearing the wrong colored suit was talked about for an entire month. Meanwhile, like President Trump literally accused Obama of something that's worthy of the death penalty, and no one remembered it a week later. So, I just wonder about this. Is this something that's part of an ongoing? Do you think it's part of an ongoing broader strategy, or do you think it's just sort of? I mean, I know you mentioned they didn't really think it through very much, but do you think this is part of any broader strategy to advance a policy or advance some sort of agenda?
Well, so talking to some of the people who like Trump himself has a lot of instincts and gut feelings that he goes on, I think, rather than kind of master plans written out. But sometimes his, gut feelings and his instincts can be very effective. And we saw the fact the way he came back and won the 2024 election. We've underestimated Trump again and again, and he's kind of sometimes he can be a very effective player, whether we love him or hate him. And but talking to some of the people around that he can get some directives from. So some of the people I think who have been more pushing for this kind of hard line, go to war on cartels kind of angle. I think this is actually, we'll see exactly how it shapes up, but I think we're starting to see a new way that the governments, including the United States, but also Latin American governments, are dealing with elements of organized crime. And so if you look at, say, what's happening in El Salvador, so in El Salvador, where he talks very much about terrorists, and he locked up 80,000 people, 1%, over 1% of the population, doubled the prison population, more than doubled it over a 9-month period. And I was down there. I've been down there repeatedly in El Salvador, but was down there right after this was happening. I actually interviewed Bukele some years back when he was very much kind of peace and love, and we're going to build football pitches and help all the neighborhoods and stuff. And then he became this like, we're going to lock everybody up. But then when you saw it, you saw this very much of a change there, and it's like, okay, there, everybody, if you've been in a gang, if you've associated with a gang, if we're in a gang 10 years ago, you're in prison and you're terrorists and there's no mercy, and it's a very, very harsh situation. And then obviously you saw even links between Bukele and the Trump administration in sending some prisoners down there, which is they've kind of stopped doing that now. They realize maybe that was a little bit too far, this kind of idea of doing that. But then you see also in Ecuador, President Noboa also taking this language of their terrorists were at war and fighting them. And then in Mexico itself, under the pressure from Trump, one of the things that Mexico did was it's now expelled, not extradited, but expelled 57 or 50 something alleged top drug traffickers to the United States, citing national security. And again, just saying they had like extradition, appeals, just went in there with the army, got them, put them on a plane, took them to the United States, and just handed them to US authorities. So again, following this kind of thing. So I think we are see changes in this. Harder line approaches, and basically, saying you're terrorists, you've got no rights, and these kind of things to do with organized crime and drug traffickers. Now, again, there are issues and problems with this situation. Is that drug trafficking has been going for years, and you can get completely non-violent drug trafficking. And I grew up around a lot of people taking drugs and a lot of people selling drugs. A lot of kids I went to school with were dealing drugs and taking drugs, and some of them died of taking drugs. And I saw a lot of this stuff around, and yeah, I mean, it'd be pretty crazy to think of missile strikes on those guys, or death penalty or whatever. At the same time, you have got within this situation that's been illegal over the last few years, you have got these cartels who have become these form of paramilitary forces with drug money, but with other things as well. With guns that have come from the United States or other places, and who are digging mass graves and carrying out this very horrific situation. So you have got this kind of genuine extreme violence that's happened at the same time. That's not completely at one with the drug trade, but it is linked to it in that sense. But we'll see how this actually works out in terms of. Oh, but another thing on this is still very all over the place. So on one side, so then they'll declare them terrorists, but they haven't hit any of the gun traffickers on terrorist charges, probably because of the NRA and probably because of the Trump base being involved in that. They want something like, fuck, we could be hit with gun trafficking charges. It's our gun shops with 170 guns.
They're coming for your guns, right? That doesn't comport with that.
Shit. We don't want Joe over there in Phoenix, his gun shops to get him done for terrorist charges. So that's one thing. But the other thing is they're still cutting these really, I think, quite obscene sweetheart deals they're giving to drug traffickers. And there's a whole, if you followed the whole trials that have been happening, the justice trials of these big Mexican drug traffickers recently, going from El Chapo onwards, but the kidnapping of El Mayo Zambada in Mexico, where it was basically a kidnapping in Mexico, a rendition taken to the United States, and then the family, the Chapitos, or the sons of El Chapo, involved in that, who are major fentanyl traffickers, suddenly making kind of sweetheart deals in the United States. And Ovidio Guzman, who's accused of being, he's pled guilty to being a major fentanyl trafficker and one of the pioneers who really made the Mexican cartels involved in the fentanyl, which happened gradually and then suddenly, from like 2013 onwards, and then suddenly from about 2019 onwards, making a deal, and all of his family members going to the United States and getting reduced crime. So you've got a lot of weird things happening at the same time. It's not a consistent hard line against drugs. It's kind of all over the place. And as I say, I don't know if you guys see it, but I don't see any kind of policy or strategy within the United States on drug use or drug overdoses
No.
right
And it's
now.
actually, I was reading that the number of drug related convictions has gone down with the increasing focus on immigration and an increasing um, pouring of money into that topic and resources into that topic. The actual number of drug convictions, high level trafficking drug convictions, has declined over the last year.
They've pulled DEA guys over into like ICE operations. Like drug enforcement federally is like a backwater. It kind of always is under Trump. Like like I don't think there's like a DEA administrator or like there's no ONDCP stuff going on, like the National Drug Control Policy Office. Like it's just he doesn't really seem to care about it, except like, on the campaign trail, he'll, talk about how fentanyl is killing Americans and poisoning the children, and it just all goes back to immigration for him. That's his instinct on it, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, immigration, and look, sort of see a lot of people for a long time like let's hit those guys with let's hit them, let's strike them, let's name some names and stuff. Sorry, Troy.
Yeah, I think that this really just underscores what we've said on this podcast since the beginning, that the war on drugs is not really about drugs. This is all kind of just a spectacle. And I really liked what you were saying, Ioan, about um, they're not really thinking this through, and that this is sort of just like we have to remember that this president is all about spectacle. He's a reality TV star, and even the example of deporting people to Seacott, that was sort of this Joseph Goebbels type propaganda film where they had this documentary crew following people getting their heads shaved and being put into this concentration camp, basically. It's that's more important. Like these strikes on these boats look good to the Fox News crowd, and I think that's why we're trying to do this podcast episode, is just because we want to really emphasize to people that this is not about the drugs. We need to reject this narrative. This is bigger, and it probably has way more to do with the fact of a lot of things, distracting from the Epstein files, um, regime change in Venezuela and getting oil from them, and that sort of thing. I really wonder, maybe I just haven't seen it or haven't looked hard enough, but it feels like there's been no outcry from the Democratic Party on this stuff. I could be wrong on that. What about the international community? Like, how are people reacting to this? It seems like a lot of people are just like, I guess if you're, a fisherman or a drug smuggler in the Caribbean, like you just have to risk getting blown up now. This is the new normal.
Yeah, so like I think Aaron was saying, when you call somebody drug traffickers and hit drug traffickers, people don't want to come out and run to defend them. So it was obviously Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela is complaining, but he's a pretty isolated kind of, seen as quite a kind of rogue rogue regime within Latin America, certainly by the United States, and then Gustavo Petro in Colombia has come out now, and he's been a kind of critic of the war on drugs to an extent. It's a little bit more complicated, but Gustavo Petro in Colombia, didn't, basically gave up on a lot of the um, aerial crop spraying of coca crops and poisoning those in Colombia. Now there is booming cocaine production in South America right now, is the truth. A lot of it is really booming more for the European market now. That's really grown. The European market's huge now, probably maybe bigger than the United States market now. It's funny that cocaine use in the United States actually maybe now lower than it was some decades ago. And it's got fairly cheap as well. People talk about like say, kilo of cocaine now, the price has gone down in dollar terms, not only forgetting about inflation, because in some ways the cocaine or part of the cocaine market, I think in the United States, was filled with crystal meth. The kind of cheap. I mean, in terms of a stimulant drug, I mean, in some ways, crystal meth. Yeah, you guys know more about this and looked into more in the like but the stimulant, crystal meth was the synthetic that in some ways mirrored cocaine, and fentanyl was a synthetic that in some ways mirrored heroin. And I think the move to the synthetic drugs, which we've seen in Mexico in a really big way the last 5-6 years, was has been a terrible, that really heated things in the United States to lead to this. I guess one of the things, the number of overdoses in the United States came very fast, didn't it? It suddenly rose very fast, and was connected very much to this switch to fentanyl in Mexico, which you started seeing from like 2013 was when you first started seeing people get heroin in Mexico. First, there was a big boom of heroin production in Mexico, following making it more difficult to get doctors to write you a script for opioids and oxycodone and stuff, which happened around 2010s, early 2010s, so correct, or late 2000s. And there's a big boom. Part of that boom was in the Guerrero area of Mexico, which is a massive state which produces a lot of opium poppies. I was up in those mountains there talking to some of the farmers, and they hit, in peso terms, they hit around 2014, 15 was their peak years for selling opium gum to people making heroin. It hit like 40,000 pesos a kilo of gum. And then now it's gone down to like 3,000 pesos. It's like totally killed now. So first of all, they started putting the fentanyl into the heroin. They called it chivo sintético, meaning synthetic goat. Goat, whatever.
Yeah, chiva.
Yeah, chivo sintético, synthetic goat. And then they got the heroin, just pumped some fentanyl into it, and then they really flipped. It was quite late. I think you saw the numbers really changed, like 2018, 2019, 2020, and it suddenly became heroin just went down, boom, and it became just fentanyl. And during that pandemic time, when it just flooded, that just heated things up in the United States.
That's when the mortality just hockey stick up.
Yeah.
And I remember the first time I ever saw fentanyl. It was in 2004. I was on the corner of Polk and Van Ness Street in San Francisco, where I used to go and cop. There was a block where I would get my tar, and I've used tar for half my childhood, most of my adult life. And one block from there was Pill Corner. So you could go a block further down, and that's where all the pharmaceuticals were sold. Well, there's a guy standing on the corner and said, "Hey, you want some Fetty?" And I was like, "What is that?" He said, "It's a patch that you suck on." And to me, it was just bizarre and alien at that time because, I was fine with tar. I've been using tar ever since the age of 14. Like, I was used to it. I knew how much to get. I knew where to get it. And I was like, I never fucked with pills. To me, like, and the folks that I ran with who shot tar, people who took pills were kind of like, hillbilly heroin, like folks who were just kind of dabbling, that took pills. And that's how we kind of perceived it. Then, oxys came around and they started to become more and more available. But even then, it was generally people who didn't have as bad of a habit, that because oxys were super expensive. It was like 70 or 80 bucks a pill, something crazy when oxys first came on the street. But this was like, 2004 or 2005. And it's not like, we talk a lot among the drug user activism community about how we didn't ask for fentanyl. It's not like we said, "Hey, this stuff is so great, give us more of it." It was just completely overnight foisted upon the drug supply. And that's why it sounds so absurd to us when we hear people blame the drug cartels for the fentanyl overdose crisis, because the whole idea of the shift to the pharmaceutical, was somewhat a combination between the medical industrial complex marketing opioids in a prescription form, and then the shift of the drug supply to adapt to the increasing ramped up enforcement that made it easier to produce and smuggle this substance that's more potent and easier to make. With methamphetamine, it can be produced here on American soil, and there's a lot of production of methamphetamine here on American soil. And it has, as you've said, it has a different effect, when combined with heroin versus combined with fentanyl. Fentanyl has a very sedating effect as compared with tar.
It's used for surgery. You're putting yourself in anesthesia.
Yeah,
Um,
like so I've
if if
spent years
if
doing
you're gonna get
both.
your
It's like
tonsils out, they'll give you fentanyl.
Yeah,
it'll
right.
knock
That's
you
not
right
that's not like
out,
a fun high.
Right. It's
So,
like
so,
you're just zoned out, like, 20 or 30 minutes after you take it. And so meth, what meth does is it kind of keeps you from getting to that state.
mm.
Cocaine is shorter acting, and so I can see like the appeal. But what I wonder about is the resiliency of these different markets, right? It's like, okay, if you blow up three boats full of cocaine, how
Mm.
does that affect the resiliency, or how do these efforts affect the resiliency of the cocaine market versus the fentanyl market, which seems to be pretty resilient? I mean, there's precursors coming from Asia and South Asia and all these different places that are being assembled in Mexico. How do you think the resiliency of the different markets are affected? Is cocaine just going to bounce back tomorrow? Like, does this have zero effect? And what about fentanyl as well?
Yeah, sure thing. So it's interesting what you're saying about the kind of evolution. You saw fentanyl on the streets as far back as 2004, and like no one had heard of it, in Mexico then. Um, and there was this thing, a case. So going back, I say kind of one of the first big cases of a link between the Chinese pharmaceutical companies and the Mexican drug traffickers was this guy Shenli Yigung. If you're familiar with his story, was a Chinese-born pharmaceutical entrepreneur who became a naturalized Mexican citizen and was importing precursors for crystal meth around the 2006 2007 time. You had the 2005 Combat Methamphetamine Act in the United States, which made it more difficult to get the precursors in the US. So that's when the Mexican cartels really getting involved in a big way in crystal meth happened. And then you had this guy Shen Yikun. He actually had, and there's crazy photos of this. They found in his house $205 million in cash in his house in Mexico City, plus $2 million in pesos. And it's a crazy photo. It's the biggest cash bust ever happened. He was going up to Vegas and he gambled like 130 million in Vegas, which is crazy. And they gave some of the money back to him in checks. Eventually, they got done for that. It was kind of a crazy story, but the about how he kind of bought in, and he's still in prison in Mexico right now. But then you kind of got this kind of movement up and the shift. I mean, I think the shift of synthetics is obviously been disastrous. I also think it's kind of um, plays into a bigger kind of sadder idea of a kind of more dislocated humanity, really. Kind of the idea of these very lethal synthetic drugs. I mean, I even think plant-based drugs has had more of a rootedness about them, at least. And then when you got these just like chemicals. But one of the things about the markets is, I was talking to some of one guy from Homeland Security Investigations, and they were on the case, building up a lot of these cases on the fentanyl trafficking. And one of the weird things was happening is that sometimes the fentanyl precursors would actually be flown into the United States from like China, smuggled down into Mexico to make into fentanyl, then back into the United States. So you get all kind of weird, triangulations and stuff happening. Another thing that's and again, I try not to be political about this in terms of because there's so many. It's such a big, complicated world, and sometimes people of all political sides can say things that happen to be true or not true. I do think there's an issue with the Canadian border there. I mean, the Canadian border. I mean, the Mexican border is 2,000 miles long. The Canadian border is 5,500 miles long.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, there's like 85% of border patrol is down on the Mexican border, and you could just walk. You could walk into the United States. I did with a colleague of mine called Katerina Schultz, who interviewed a Mexican cartel guy in Canada. She's Canadian, and she's been working down here. And they're cooking it up there. They're cooking it up in Canada, and they can walk it over the border to the United States. And they're not catching it. It's pretty hard to that the border. So that's something else as well to come in there. But on the cocaine, I mean, look, this is early days yet. So these strikes only began. I mean, they began in early September, so it's only been 6-7 weeks. They've really they only hit the Pacific like last week, and they've only started. So we'll have to see. Now there are other ways if they're hitting the boats. there are other ways they can get the cocaine north. So they can get it. I mean, for a long time they fly it north. Now they're going to start shooting down planes. Because there was a lot of for a long time there was a lot of planes coming out of Venezuela. In fact, they'd fly into Honduras. Some of them flew into Mexico. I was going to talk to a pilot called Fernando Blengio, who was a Mexican guy. He owned airplanes, and he was flying cocaine north. A lot of these things. So they're going to shoot down planes. The other thing is over land. Now there's a difficult bit with the Darien Gap. You've got the kind of jungle and stuff there. But then again, if the money's there, and is this going to push the price of cocaine up? Maybe. We'll see. But the problem is, and this is one of the difficulties with the clandestine economy, is if you push the price up, it means there's more incentive to do it. And so that's the same that happened with human smuggling over the border. I mean, human smuggling used to cost. I talked to this one human smuggler who back in the 80s would let people walk into the United States through a hole in the fence. And the first time I did it, he charged like 50 cents. I'd come over, give it, give me a tip, and then it went up to like $5,000. Now it's like $10,000. But then because there's more money, then there's an incentive for people to do it. So, will this? I would say that looking at like drug prohibition, and I, obviously I'm fully on board that the war on drugs has been a complete and utter failure. I also now feel just more disillusioned with stuff. That's just me, maybe just getting. I always feel disillusioned. I used to kind of have more of a strong belief that there would be a kind of legalization which would actually turn this around, and now it's become quite disillusioned. However, I do think from experience, if we look at say different countries' experience, let's say the Taliban in Afghanistan, I mean they probably have seriously reduced the amount of heroin coming out of Afghanistan, but that's because they're a seriously authoritarian regime. And do you want that? And I don't think Americans have the appetite for that. So what one of the things that America has is it has kind of sometimes quite a harsh line on drugs. At other times, it's not really ever follows it through. It never really follows it through. So people can kind of find a way around it. I don't know what you guys feel about that, or how things are in the US drug market right now.
I think disillusionment is totally the word, but there's we have this kind of tension with drug laws, and I think gun laws kind of hit at the same corner of a kind of fierce defense of civil liberties. There's a very hardcore strain of just libertarianism in America, and then drug laws run kind of always just cut against that. And I think I think Ioan, you interviewed me a while ago after Oregon decriminalized drugs, and there was a lot of triumph at this huge feat. A state is going to kind of pursue a straightforward public health approach, and there's like a strain of civil libertarianism in there where people are going to use their drugs for personal means and we're not going to interfere. And then the pandemic happened. The streets of Oregon became, a quote unquote war ravaged city. And there were very real images of tent cities and public drug use. And the results of that, it was unraveled in just a matter of a couple of years. So like the disillusionment, I think, is very real. Like the one time decrim gets pushed through, it's undone before we could even actually see what happens. And you can't like do a 180 reversal on drug enforcement in 2 years. Like the drug enforcement strategy, policing, it's been going on for decades, and to undo that, you need to build new systems, you need a lot more infrastructure, you need a lot more public health infrastructure that America just doesn't have, especially in a state like Oregon, which has like abysmal access to social and health resources. It's a weird state. Outside of Portland, it's just rural. People are kind of just like living out in the mountains out there. So it was an interesting state to do decrim for
Mm.
one thing.
Yeah.
And then had the pandemic not coincided with it, something better could have come of it. But I think in terms of where things are at, the choice between harsh enforcement, blowing up boats, just libertine policy. I mean, we don't have a lot of good options on the menu right now, I'd say.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's interesting. Like with compared to Portugal, obviously the Portugal's got a pretty good health system, from what I
Mhm.
understand, and so a lot of
And
kind of
policing there is very different. Like cops behave differently there. There's a different style of policing. Like the police, I think in Oregon went basically on like a general strike, a
Right.
silent strike to like sabotage
Yeah.
the policy change.
They were supposed to be the agents of the process.
They were supposed to
And
cite people and refer them to a hotline. So
yeah,
that didn't quite work out.
we're going to take the same people who've been arresting people for drug crimes and ask them. I mean, it's almost like if you tried to go to crypto overnight, like how well would that work? I mean, you literally have to build a system in parallel to the current banking system to make something like crypto work. You couldn't just switch overnight, as with all the promises that it has. So I just think, I agree with Zach. I mean, it's like, you can't just take these systems that have been in place and are culturally embedded and try them out for a year or two and expect them to be A, work, and B, be adopted culturally, which is the bigger question.
I mean, my I think again this shift to synthetic drugs, it kind of happened fast, and you used to see it's kind of like hillbilly heroin or whatever, like people who take pills before. I have more experience with the addicts or with the users on this side of the border. Um, no, so I knew a lot of people who used heroin back in the day in the UK when I was a teenager or a young guy there, and the people I knew who were on heroin was still people I would could talk to. They could still kind of have a conversation with them. And I saw a lot of the like generally in terms of drugs here, there's a funny system here in Mexico where for a while the cartels, I mean, even before they were called cartels, the traffickers, but the kind of the powerful guys will be saying, okay, we're not going to sell for first thing, we're not going to sell cocaine in Mexico. Cocaine's for the gringos. Then they started selling cocaine in Mexico because it was too tempting. You sell somebody a brick of cocaine and they can sell it on the street. And then for a while, they're like, okay, crystal meth. When they got into that in 2005, okay, we sell crystal meth to the gringos, but we don't sell it in Mexico. But then they did. It spilled out here. Now it's a big issue. In fact, it's quite a underreported story. A lot of crystal meth use around Mexico now, and in rural areas, and a lot of fighting. In fact, a lot of deaths are just some of one of the highest. The state with the highest per capita murders in Mexico is Colima. Now, Colima is where the biggest port is of Manzanillo, where a lot of the precursors come in as boats coming straight from China there. But a lot of the fighting is not really actually among the big cartels fighting over that route. It's among local crystal meth dealers selling to farm workers and factory workers there, and then shooting each other over these little spots, selling crystal meth on the street there. Um, but then you start to see crystal meth, and then in Tijuana, particularly, there's also a lot of fentanyl on the street there. And there's an area there. If you got familiar with Tijuana, there's a kind of canal which is kind of makes up the border in some areas,
Yeah.
and there's a bunch of people who hang around this canal,
Yeah.
and you can go around there,
Yeah. I
and
used to
around
go there.
yeah. I used to go and get high, yeah, or Tijuana's a fun city. It's a fun city as well. It's actually the kind of the most fun border city.
I've,
Uh,
I've read your work though. There's a lot of fentanyl use in Tijuana.
yeah.
And so
In
there's like
that
Right.
there's
place,
like spillage and blowback. Whatever the cartel's producing for the gringos, it
yeah,
breaks containment and spills
yeah.
over onto the
Yeah,
Mexican
exactly.
population.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Tijuana, Mexicali, they're talking about that basically. They're all there. They're talking about it starts spilling into Juarez as well. So it's interesting to there you start getting it now. It does to me just talking, just when I went and it was interviewing the guys there, they seem on a different level of being out of it compared to the heroin
On the synthetic stuff. Yeah.
users I used to know.
Yeah.
I mean, do they, but so you mentioned the increase in methamphetamine use. Is that being perceived as an import? I mean, you said it's being produced in Mexico, but it didn't used to be as prevalent. Is that being seen as sort of an import from the United States? Sort of an American thing to do more meth? Or is anybody seeing it that way, or is it just being fully integrated?
Uh, in fact, it's not a story which has got like big national conscious. And in fact, there hasn't been enough reporting on this, but it's where it's big. It's often in like a lot of these working class communities. I mean, I'll talk, for example, the guy I buy orange juice from down the road is from a little village in Mexico State. And there's like loads of people now in his village taking meth. Um, so a lot of these, in Michoacan, where I've been down there, there's a lot of guys there who are like, they call it yellow, like ice. And I would say that they just see it as kind of being a vice. I don't know. They think they go to see all these, these are people who are like viciados. They're like, guys who are out of it, and it's kind of bad. But it's something which hasn't, I don't think that the wealthier society has really got on board this or made recognize this enough. But if you look a lot, there's a lot of some of the quite horrific um a bit careful about seeing how much the violence, I've always been quite suspicious about how much actually being on drugs makes people violent. It's more about the money.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, but there is a case that some of these, young guys with AK-47s and grenades who are like teenagers and they're on meth, it doesn't help when they're like, like doing
Haven't
quite
slept
kind
for
of,
a week. Yeah,
yeah,
going without sleep is that's the worst part of it. Yeah.
kind of violent.
There's something you mentioned a while back, Ioan. I know we're going long and we're covering a lot of topics here, but you mentioned Claudia Scheinbaum as being a kind of like savvy operator who knows how to maybe navigate around Trump a little better than some other politicians and leaders. Can you discuss her style kind of dealing with Trump to maybe avoid direct strikes on, let's say, a fentanyl lab or going, how is she preventing, the American military from just blowing up fentanyl production in Mexico, A, and then B, yeah, just like what is her general strategy for dealing with this kind of like hungry military empire just to the north of her.
So yeah, she's been. I mean, I would say a very interesting president. And when she first came in, I mean, she's only been in power for a year. It was hard to judge. Would she just be a puppet of the previous president? She was his mentee, Andres Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, and she's been. I would say she is very smart and talented at politics and talented at power, but not in an overly authoritarian way. This is my take. I mean, there's a big constituency of people who really dislike her as well. But like, this is my take. Whereas she's very different from Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia, who's very much, he was in New York, in fact, saying, disobey your president. Let's send a global thing to Palestine and all this kind of stuff. And he'll just like, he'll go into some rant about like, attacking Trump, or like going back to Hugo Chavez or Fidel Castro, who were these. I mean, they were very effective in their way. I think Gustavo Petro is not an effective populist in that way, but like Chavez was, very fire rhetoric, but he would say he'd go into the United Nations. It smells of sulfur. George W. Bush was here, and he had this like a very, he's very. I saw him in his last. He was a very charismatic, interesting character. Claudia Scheinbaum's very centered. Um, but also, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, who's a left-wing populist, got on very well with Trump as well. And she does as well. And so what she does is, first of all, they look at right now, Mexico sells like 80% of its exports to the United States, or maybe more, maybe 90%. There's like it's like 2/3 of a trillion in cross-border trade in goods between Mexico and the United States. So the economies are super intertwined. So she wants to protect that. At the same time, she wants to play to her base as her base, of nationalist feelings, stand up to the gringos, stand up to the United States. So she'll kind of play this kind of double, discourse, which will to have a bit more of a nationalist discourse. And she's very popular. She's got like, 70-80% approval rating. And then she'll go to Trump and deal. And often after these calls, he'll say, "Oh, I like," and she came a very difficult, because she came to power and he came out saying Mexican presidency is working with drug cartels and all this kind of stuff. Now, the actual massive reduction of immigration on the border, and there is a massive reduction. We're talking about immigration, number of people crossing the border into the United States went down like 90%, 95% from its peak. And there's various things, but if part of this is, again, the Mexican military will round them up before they get to the US border. Also, again, this is corruption system. The president talks to the head of security talks to the generals talk to the cartels. I got word from people who along the border, like in Juarez, you have safe houses full of migrants. There's areas where they cross them in, areas where they climb over. I went and filmed them climbing over the wall in ladders and stuff. It's kind of amazing. They had word, you're not moving people. In the first days of presidency, don't move anybody. So one of Trump's few victories in his terms is saying the border's quiet now. There's people not coming over the border. And Mexico and Sheinbaum helped give him that victory. The other thing was the reduction in fentanyl coming. Now, some of it, I think, starting to rebound a bit now. The fentanyl. The numbers starting to come back up again.
It'd be interesting to see that on our end, because we've had a lot of other types of substances that seem to be seeping in. Xylazine, medetomidine, and there has been a bit of a decline in the availability of fentanyl here, in the United States. But if as you say, production seems to be stabilizing or even increasing there, we'll probably see a difference here in the future.
So do you think the price of pills, I mean, when people on the street in the US actually buy fentanyl, do they even call it fentanyl, or just say what, or just call it dope? Or what do people on the street actually say when they're buying a pill of
Probably
fentanyl?
Depends where you are, but yeah.
It's usually slang, but people are aware that it's fentanyl. I mean, folks are not expecting anything else at this point,
Right.
But as we said, now you have all these other substances that are turning up, tranquilizers and shit like that. And people don't find out about those until after the fact. I mean, no one knows that they're buying those.
You mean like benzodrine, or whatever it's called? Is it like trank dope and that kind of stuff you're talking about?
Yeah.
Like, and have you got a sense of the prices going up, or the price is stable?
I haven't seen too much fluctuation. I think at some point prices are going to go down because there's less and less actual fentanyl. But again, as Zach has said, it depends on where you are, because the trade routes are different. So you have by land, you have by sea, and you have different trade routes that affect the availability. I wonder, it's not a new thing that drug laws and the drug war, as they call it, is being tied to protectionism and nationalism, or being tied to, jingoism, this idea of outsiders. I mean, that's what we attribute our drug laws to. Folks who are savvy to history. A lot of us have just come to take the drugs being, most drugs being illegal for granted. But people who have an eye to history know that it's always been tied to protectionism. It's always been tied to threats from the outside. the Chinese are getting white women hooked on opium and luring them into dens, or the African men are becoming superhuman and when they take cocaine, and all of these dog whistling narratives that have taken place. So it's not anything new to really be tying drugs to protectionism or nationalism, or this idea of exceptionalism, American exceptionalism, at least culturally here. But what I wonder is, is there going to be a point at which people start to recognize the rise of authoritarianism? Because I heard a statistic recently that there are more people in the world, in other countries around the world, living under authoritarian regimes, and it's the highest that it's been since 1978. And that rise began right around the time that we gained the ability to reshare things on the internet and start to interact on the internet, which is an interesting discussion in and of itself. But I can't help but wonder if there's going to be a point at which people recognize this drug war rhetoric as a tool of authoritarianism, as a way of sidestepping transparency in political actions, sidestepping transparency in implementing nationalist agendas. Because that's really, to me, it's plain to see that that's what it's being used as, specifically in the conversation that we've had, with blowing up boats, or just with everything that's being done. It's basically being used as a tool to do more with less transparency, which is what authoritarian regimes are all about. But I just can't help but wonder at what point people might start to make the connection between the two, because I know a lot of people are recognizing this rise in authoritarianism, and the threats to democracy globally. That's something I wonder about.
It's an interesting one. I think there's a lot of different strands to this. Like you were saying before about like say like blaming outsiders for drugs coming in, blaming foreigners. One of the problems as well that I think happened within for those of us who cover the drugs issue, and I think probably a blow to the kind of drug policy reform movement, which maybe it hasn't, maybe it's struggling to deal with, is the way that fentanyl changed the game so radically. I mean, like beforehand, if we go back to they said before, don't just say no. Weed will kill you, cocaine will kill you, and you're like, no, it won't. They're lying. And then fentanyl did actually kill people in a pretty big way. So it's a hot, we have to change. It's like, okay, this stuff is bad. And so when you say, there was these Mexican traffickers were moving a poison that was killing people. And as I say, there's obviously a bunch of reasons. You can say, well, there's a bunch of reasons in the United States why people are taking this stuff, and all kinds of things, but still they are selling these drugs, picking them and moving them over. Again, a caveat to that they are now making a deal with one of the biggest fentanyl dealers. They're happy to make a sweetheart deal with them and give them benefits. That's something else. But as well as that, so with a lot of these issues now with the kind of using drugs or fight against crime as an authoritarian step, sometimes it's a problem when these things, when there's we have that's definitely true, and also we have real problems from some of these things. So if we look at Bukele again in El Salvador, so Bukele has clearly been authoritarian. If you're familiar with there's a crew of journalists, kind of an online magazine called El Faro. Most of them have now fled the country. There have been people who've been very good reporters of El Salvador, of the deals made with gangs and stuff in the past. At the same time, the gang problem in El Salvador is very real. El Salvador had one of the highest murder rates in the world, and it's been reduced. A lot of people could not walk down the street there for fear of gangs, and it's been reduced. But he's also authoritarian. So both those things are true. He's using the clamp down on gangs to be authoritarian, and he's saying, I've got to be re-elected. And it's true there was a problem with gangs. And the same with they've now, partly because of fentanyl, which really was killing a lot of people. That's part of the reason they moved to making cartels terrorists. And then they're now using that to justify missile strikes on cocaine boats, which is not even the original fentanyl. and part of a reason for a regime change for something else. So yeah, yeah. I think it's like, but yeah, I mean, but the bigger issue with kind of a move towards authoritarian, I think that's a big problem. In it's a bit different in Latin America compared to in the United States or in Europe. In that, in the United States and Europe, there was a big democratic tradition that flourished for quite a long time, and now it's under threat. Um, in Latin America, I mean, Latin America was run by a lot of it was run by military dictatorships throughout the 20th century. We had this kind of brief moment of kind of everywhere's going to be democracies, and then some of it's gone back. Now there's different kinds of authoritarian systems. So like, and some with the same ideology, like Cuba, for example. If you're familiar with Cuba, Cuba's like regular crime is very low in Cuba. It's a very authoritarian government, and a regular crime is low. And there's none of the gangsters have got guns. You feel very safe in Cuba. Like you feel there's anything on it. None of these guys have got guns. This is a completely different night and day compared to being a lot of Latin America. Whereas Venezuela is like an authoritarian government politically, but then there's gangsters all over the place. There's like that really heavily armed gangs, like robbing people left, right, and center. So it's kind of a bit of a narco tyranny type situation. But yeah, I mean, I think the world is going more authoritarian again, or maybe the idea of the kind of end of history, the whole world's going to be democratic, was a bit of a wishful thinking. And we'll see. I think it's probably a hard battle, or maybe a battle which needs to be fought, particularly in the United States and Europe, of maintaining democracy there, where you've got a tradition of it. And we'll see how much of Latin America how much democracy can survive here.
Yeah. I think, just to wrap up, I really want to leave listeners with some kind of very rough roadmap of where we go from here. All of this is really focused on the supply side and not the demand. I don't see anything coming out of this current administration that's dealing with opening up more rehabs or getting methadone access to be better or safe supply or even just syringe access. It's just focusing on the flashy military style enforcement. Well, what can people do about it? What can we do to stop this? Like, because it does seem like it's going to escalate. There's a lot of talk about striking not just boats, but like the actual countries. And it, just the way we've seen the forever war happen with the war on terror, it can be decades and trillions of dollars down the toilet and countless civilian deaths, destabilization of countries. It's just this could get a lot worse, and I want to give people some sort of idea of what we can do to fight back.
That's a very, very good and sobering thought. It could be the case of just like endlessly hitting alleged drug labs and drug traffickers with missiles in like multiple countries, just constantly hitting all the time. It's kind of crazy. Um, I think from one of the important things in the United States, or from the kind of drug policy reform point of view, is what successes can be made there to kind of a change the actual demand side, so that drugs are coming through. And that could be, I guess it could be a couple of things. I mean, one, it can be like legalizing marijuana, which did kill the supply, the need. I mean, there's not marijuana dollars are no longer supplying the stuff. I mean, would it be better if the United States supplied its own opioids or whatever? I don't know what you guys' thoughts are now, where you're at now in that conversation in the United States, or you particularly about like for dealing with people who are opioid users or opiate users. Is it more about switching to like methadone or other things now? Um, is there can there really be better rehab and better prevention is out the way, or I don't know what your guys' thoughts are on that. But that's one thing I think from the US point of view, from a drug point of view, is like, can it can that demand I mean if you look at the US drug market according to the Rand survey, which is not an exact science, but it's what we have, $150 billion a year. So if you look at that over 10 years, $1.5 trillion, and over $23 trillion, just this endless source of money going to the cartels. And it's like, and I kind of don't believe, I mean, it's kind of pretty hard to say to people, don't do drugs. You're only giving money to killers. That really works. Like,
Don't think that message works.
yeah. So I
Yeah.
grew up in a drug taking environment, and it wasn't like kids there thought about some faraway country, whatever, drugs in those days, the heroin came from like Afghanistan or something. I wouldn't think about that.
Yeah.
But how
Yeah.
can you stop that? So it'd be interesting where it is, where things are at with the conversation in the United States right now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well,
Go
I,
ahead,
I,
Joy.
I don't think we have all the answers yet. It's a really complex, evolving situation. I think one of the things that we can do is what we're doing right now, is dispelling this mythology that these strikes are justified or even legal. I think I would love to see a lot more pushback on the administration. I really would be surprised to see it, but that's ideally, saying they don't have the authority to be doing these drug strikes. They don't have the authority to expand this war, because they're trying to use the term narcoterrorism to be like, oh, this is sort of an expansion of the war on terror that happened after 9/11. They gave unprecedented powers to the executive branch to basically blow up whoever they fucking wanted. I mean, even Obama did that. Like, he blew up an American citizen with a drone, and he had the authority to do that, apparently. So they're sort of using that legal argument now to just be like, well, let's do it this way. So pushback on that, I think, is a good way of doing it, dispelling the mythology. And yeah,
Well, I was just gonna end on saying, yeah, to make the this kind of really militaristic drug war, to make it make less sense to the population, and not that I think this is really going to move the needle a ton, but if there is actual progress on the demand side, like if there is better public health responses, if we do have a functioning treatment infrastructure, if people can get alternatives to the synthetic, mutant opioids out there that don't just murder you the second you touch them, allegedly. If those things do change, then there's a lot less justification for striking. I mean, not that there's a lot right now, but there's at least a morsel of truth that they can use to justify what they're doing. And yes, they're blowing up boats full of cocaine, which has nothing to do with fentanyl. Fentanyl doesn't come from Venezuela. We know this. But yeah, I think if the actual demand side, it can actually improve lives and make us healthy, then yeah, there's a lot less justification for what's going on. If you can point to 100,000 people dying from fentanyl and justify a lot based on that.
Yeah, it's been interwoven as a weapon of mass destruction since the Obama administration, or even
Yeah,
before.
the
It's been,
terrorists, the
yeah,
WMDs. Troy's totally right. They're just laying the groundwork to make a new forever war.
I mean, it felt like we were making a little progress there for a while with talking about, syringe service programs and the government funding some harm reduction services. But then it's like two steps forward and three back.
Yeah.
It's just,
Mhm.
it's been so incrementally frustrating in many different ways, but we think a lot in the drug user activism community about changing hearts and minds when it comes to how we just view people who use drugs, because for the average person, whether it's in the media, which is part of what this show is about, is challenging the media narrative. or in the news, pundits, and the way people frame drug use is that people who use drugs are poor unfortunates who have diseased brains and are hijacked and need to be treated like children. And on the other end, we have the dealers who are the bad psychopaths that need to be locked away. And we've had a lot of discussions about the Venn diagram between those two and how much overlap there really is. But drugs in America is just something we all kind of do, but we pretend like we don't. It's kind of like sex. We have this hypersexualized culture, and yet, we can't say that because it's not cool, and so I think, most Americans dabble recreationally with illicit drugs. And then you have people who turn and delve more into them, whether through predisposition. I like taking certain drugs more than drinking. I don't really enjoy drinking. Drinking is like the American pastime, and you have people who prefer one or the other naturally. So I don't think you're going to take away the demand for drugs. I think it's unrealistic to think that you can take away the demand for drugs, but there are incremental steps towards safer ways of using drugs, and Americans in general don't know how to use drugs safely. I mean, heck, if we want to fit it into the current political narrative, let's put America first. Let's make all the drugs in America. But we have this problem, like,
make drugs great again, get rid of fentanyl.
Make drugs great again. Put America first.
I've got a roll, but that's a good thought to end on now. Make America America first. Make American drugs great again. Good old get the bikers back in making the crystal meth.
I want Hell's Angels to run drugs again,
and then back to Oxycontin.
Bring jobs back.
And opium.
All right, guys.
Okay, well, look,
that's a great place to wrap up.
Guys,
thanks, Ioan.
Now in the conversation our time.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on the show. Where can people find you? I know you have a media site, crashoutmedia.com. That's a great.
It's a Substack. It's great. It's, come along, and there's a lot of stuff there for free. So you can just find it at Crash Out on Substack or www.crashoutmedia.com. And I'm also a lot on Twitter. Again, my funny weird name, IOANGRILLO on Twitter. And you can also have some stuff on YouTube as well.
Cool. We'll drop those links.
Thanks for your time today.
Okay. Take care. Take care, guys. Have a good one.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Narcotica, an independent production by Narco Media. Co-hosted and co-produced by Troy Farah, Christopher Maraff, and Aaron Ferguson. If you like the show, you can find out more at narcocast.com and support us by joining our Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/narcotica. We are excited to announce that a portion of the proceeds from the show will now go toward the Urban Survivors Union, which is the National Drug Users Union, a group of directly impacted advocates for drug user health in America. This is the way social change happens from the ground up, and we are so excited to support this group that is doing such important work to fight stigma against people who use drugs. If you're a patron, you also get free stickers which are personally mailed to you. You can also request a shout out on the show. And now patrons can even get 30% off of merch in our new store, which is at narcocast.myshopify.com. We have t-shirts and coffee mugs, one that says "There are drugs in here," which is awesome. More stuff will be added soon. As always, we're so grateful to the folks that make this show possible. A little goes a long way, so thanks for making Narcotica happen. We're ad-free and we want to keep it that way. If Patreon just isn't for you, that's fine. You can help us out by spreading the word. Tell all your friends about the podcast, advocating for social justice and abolishing the drug war. You can also rate us wherever you get your podcasts. Our theme music is by Glassboy, and Jenny Shea is the voice of Narcotica. Additional music is by myself, alias Nomad1, drug using producer. Well, I guess that's all. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Until next time.